Studies at Wayne State University in Detroit, where I've been teaching courses on Islamic history, politics, and culture for the last 12 years, as well as an adjunct professor at Rochester College, which is an evangelical college in suburban Detroit, where I teach a course on Christian-Muslim understanding for the last 6 years. But before that, in 2001, I co-founded the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding shortly after 9/11 because there was a realization that in order for Muslims to maintain their seat at the table, we needed to first go ahead and understand the Muslim community in America, and particularly to have some hard data and evidence to refute what oftentimes are the falsehoods and the false statements that are made about Islam and about Muslims. So tonight, our, inshallah, presentation is actually going to be about what is going on in the rhetoric that we hear today, which is Islamophobia, politics, priorities, and prejudice in 2016. A little bit of background as to exactly what our mission is at ISPU. We conduct objective solution-seeking research that empowers American Muslims to develop their community and fully contribute to both the democracy and the pluralism in the United States. Now, we are a tax-exempt nonprofit organization, so we do not advocate any particular political candidate or any political party, but a lot of the research that we have done, particularly over the last few years, is entirely about the elections and what particular political parties have been saying and doing toward Muslims. We have a fairly simple objective. We look to develop, we look to contribute, and we look to innovate by focusing on three major areas: social policy, domestic policy, as well as thought leadership. And we find that by discovery, by education, and by enabling people with the right information, it helps them to go ahead and create the narrative of Islam in opposition to the narrative that oftentimes is created about us in a negative way. Now, some of the more recent reports that, any luck? No. That we have, oh, is that just me? Oh, okay, I'm not that interesting. That we have been doing are reports on American Muslims in the 2016 election and beyond, as well as a report on the American Muslim polling. And I invite you to go to ispu.org. All of the reports are available, and they're all free to download. Now, I'm sure, especially here in Dallas and with what happened in Garland a few months ago, it's no secret about the perception of Muslims. I've been listening to some of the Christian stations while I've been here over the weekend, and it seems as though they cannot go more than 10 minutes without going ahead and defaming Islam in some way. I think in many ways we're probably defamed at least less than Hillary Clinton is on some of these radio stations, but it's only just slightly less. Some of you know that 61% of Americans hold an unfavorable view of Islam. In fact, Islam has a higher favorability rating than even atheists. But at the same time, it's also important to know this statistic, that only half of the American population claims to even know a Muslim. And similar studies have shown that those Americans who know a Muslim, who interact with a Muslim, and of course we're talking about ones that they can identify as being Muslim, that they have a far greater and more positive impact and impression of Muslims and of Islam as a whole. Now, it's very difficult for them to formulate a positive impression about Muslims if they don't meet Muslims and if most of their impression about Islam and Muslims is being constructed by the media. Studies have shown that 80% of the coverage in the media about Islam is negative. So to find that 1/5 or that 20% is very, very difficult. Now, how do Muslims fit into other religions when it comes to reporting religious discrimination? Well, our reports have shown that currently 18% of Muslims polled claim that they regularly face some kind of religious discrimination, 16% claim occasionally, and then 26% say rarely, 38% say never. Compare this to other communities. 18% of Muslims claim regularly that they face discrimination, while only 5% of Jews, 4% of Catholics, and 2% of Protestants face the same. So we are at least 3 times as high as the next group when it comes to the amount of discrimination that is being faced. When it comes to the public perception of Islam and Muslims, most of you, of course, remember 9/11. And we thought that at that point, and it would make sense, that the negative impression of Islam and Muslims would have been at its highest then. But what we found over the last 15 years is that since all of those years have passed after the acts of 9/11, that the impression of Muslims has become more and more unfavorable. So one of the questions that we had with ISPU is to try to explain how is it that as we create more distance in time from 9/11, why has the unfavorability rating of Muslims not either plateaued or maybe even improved? And it didn't seem to make sense that it was just because of what was going on in the Middle East, or what was going on with Al-Qaeda, or what was going on with ISIS, ISIL, or Daesh, even in the United States. There had to be something else to go ahead and explain it. So this then became one of our consuming projects when it came to ISPU over the last few years. So what we're going to look at, inshallah, tonight, in the brief time that I have with you, is to show how we take data, and from that, just like any other think tank in Washington, and by the way, there are 2,000 think tanks in Washington and in the United States as a whole. There's only one that focuses on Muslims in the United States full-time, and that is us. We want to go ahead and have that data and then be able to provide recommendations, not just for the community itself, but also for policymakers. It's remarkable how much impact and influence data has on policymakers, and even in some of the strangest and implausible areas, we find that policy affects and influences our lives. Now, one of the things that we wanted to take a look at is what was the American Muslim engagement when it came to elections, voting, campaigns, political contributions, and lobbying. And what we found in the U.S. elections report with American Muslims is that when it came to how engaged we were with the community, Muslims are very engaged within the Muslim community, but they are comparable when it comes to how much they interact with the rest of society. So 38% of Muslims polled say that they interact routinely with broader society, compared to 40% of Jews, 42% of Catholics, and 50% of Protestants. But at the same time, we also wanted to take a look at how many Muslims are registered to vote and how many are planning to vote. So what we found was that 60% of the Muslim population is in fact registered to vote, those who would be eligible. And in fact, we find that 36% increase has happened since the 2012 election. So this number is certainly going up, but it's still much lower than other groups. Whereas 60% of the Muslim community is registered to vote, that compares to 86% of the Jewish community, 95% of the Catholic community, and 94% of the Protestant community. So we're still a bit of a challenge to get the numbers up. At the same time, when it comes to planning to vote, 85% of those who are registered say that they are planning to vote from the Muslim community. But when we take a look at Jews, Catholics, and Protestants, it's 99, 97, and 98% respectively. So there's almost a total voting motivation, if you will, among these other communities, whereas we still have a bit of a wiggle room. All the trends seem to be pointing toward a greater sense of voting, but we still haven't reached that mark yet. And I think part of that goes to the idea that voting is still considered by some to be discretionary. It is considered by some to be an exercise in futility. We find that the top reasons that Muslims have said in our survey as to why they want to vote is, number one, at 27%, they consider it to be a civic duty or an obligation, and 22% say that they want to make a difference. So there's an optimism that the vote does count. But the same survey showed the top reasons for why Muslims are not planning on voting. 19% said that they don't think that their vote is going to make any difference, that it's not going to count, and that has nothing to do with whether they think that the elections are rigged, but that what they want or what they think they're voting for is not going to be something that will translate after the election. And then 17% just simply don't like any of the people running. Which, of course, is not a very big surprise given the pool of candidates today. But at the same time, it also shows how we see the election. Now, generally speaking, in the U.S., there is a trend, and this is not just within the Muslim community, that we only get excited about elections every 4 years. The midterm elections tend not to be very exciting for some reason. It's the same as my students. They are all concerned about the final exam, but they're not concerned about the midterm exam. That's a very big mistake because the midterm is an important part of their grade. But the other thing that people also think about when they hear the word election is they think of this White House that is located on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and they think about the presidency. But for anybody who has gone into the polling booth, it is not just about the presidency. Even on a presidential election year like 2016, the entire Congress is up for election or re-election, which is 435 seats. 1/3 of the Senate comes up, somewhere between 33 to 34 seats. And then we have to talk about the state, and we have to talk about the city, and we have to talk about the county, and we have to talk about ballot initiatives, and we have to talk about state boards of education. That's something that is critical here in the state of Texas. The people who are elected onto the State Board of Education decide the textbooks that are then going to be on the curriculum of every single public school district. And I can assure you that the State Board of Education of Texas is something that we are exploring and that we are investigating very carefully because of their hostility not only to Islam and Muslims, but also looking to exclude other parts of American history that they find to be problematic. Sorry? The thumb drive. Okay. So when it comes then to voting, I can totally appreciate when people say that they don't like anybody running, but it's not just between who might be the first woman to be president or who might be the first person with a very questionable hairdo to be president. There are a lot more issues that are abound, and it is at those levels where we think that the difference is not going to be made where they sometimes have the biggest impact. Think about zoning commissions. Think about city councils, particularly when it comes to Masjid looking for zoning variances, construction of Islamic schools, or other issues which, of course, affect the lives of Muslims and others every single day. Now, one of the project stakeholders for the U.S. American Muslim election survey said the following: legislation is important because no civilized society can function effectively without order and structure. And the legislation that we create and the legislation created by elected officials helps to move our republic forward. We're still one big experiment in democracy, but when we have numerous voices, numerous opinions, various inputs, I think it makes for greater community and greater society. This is one of our advisors who, in fact, gave this quote. And part of that then is also an understanding that Muslim Americans have or need to have about how the political system works. We actually don't get to vote on issues. We get to vote for people who then represent us in the government or in the various forms of government. So we find then, especially when it comes to these anxieties that we have, whether voting is even important, whether it makes a difference, whether we are committing some blunder or some kind of an ethical spasm by voting, and the person may not be a very ideal candidate. It is really the only system, and particularly when it comes to the ability for Muslims to have a voice. And in 2016, I'm sure that you have noticed that Muslims are the issue. Whether they are demonized or whether they are celebrated, Muslims are part of the fabric like in no other time that we've seen. Think back in 2008 when some of the controversies were that a Masjid could not be behind a candidate at a rally and they were being asked to move. These days we find that at least with one side of the political aisle, there is almost always a Muslim, particularly a Muslim woman with a hijab in the background, and not just for the optics. One of the things that makes the Muslim American community so readily available as a mosaic for the broader American community is how ethnically diverse it is from within. So we find that 24% of the Muslim American community is from Asia, either South or Southeast Asia. 23% is African American. The Hispanic community is the fastest growing at about 6%. White Muslims constitute 19%. And something that, it's always interesting to find data that you didn't know before. 1% of the Muslim American community is Native American. And because of what's happening at North Dakota with Standing Rock, it shows then this need for solidarity with the Native American community. Again, a community that most Muslims would never have thought would have that kind of number. And if the Muslim community in America is somewhere between 5 to 8 million, then 1% of that is somewhere between 50 to 80,000. That's a sizable number of people. We find also in the survey that when it comes to what issues do Muslims prioritize, they are exactly the same as every other community, especially if you compare it along faith lines. So the top three are the economy, civil rights, and education. None of the communities, when they are polled, find terrorism to be within the top three. And yet, of course, this is the narrative that is constructed by the media and others, particularly those who are looking to promote Islamophobia. Now, rewind back to the 2012 elections, and some of you probably remember the commentary and the coverage of it, but I thought I'd read a few quotes from some of the people whom you're probably familiar with. Quote, "The white establishment is now the minority, and the voters, many of them feel that the economic system is stacked against them and they want stuff. You're going to see a tremendous Hispanic vote for President Obama, overwhelming black vote for President Obama, and women will probably break Obama's way. People feel that they are entitled to things, and which candidate between the two is going to give them things. The demographics are changing. It's not a traditional America anymore." This was Bill O'Reilly on Fox News on election night 2012. And pay attention to the way that he puts this. The white establishment is now the minority, and the demographics are changing, and that it is not a traditional America anymore. So you know the phrase dog whistling. Basically, you go ahead and you say certain things in code, hoping that it'll reach certain audiences without being too explicit. Well, here you see an example of somebody now becoming explicit in that language. Rush Limbaugh, the day after the elections, said, quote, "I went to bed last night thinking we are outnumbered. I went to bed last night thinking we've lost the country. I don't know how else you look at this," unquote. So if you're looking at wondering who is we and what is traditional America, Mr. Limbaugh and Mr. O'Reilly are essentially saying white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. Okay? And it's interesting, if you study the immigration trends to the country, those migrant groups that came in, especially at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, all started to see the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant model as the one to which they needed to aspire and the one that they needed to try to emulate. Things, of course, have changed quite a bit from that. So the sister survey that we did to the one on elections is actually a couple of years older, and it was one that I drafted called Manufacturing Bigotry. Many of you remember in the year 2010, in the summer, there were two controversies. One was the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, the Park 51 controversy in New York, and the other was a reverend from Florida, Terry Jones, who wanted to come to Dearborn, Michigan, and burn copies of the Quran. And we were wondering, what was it about that summer? You know, they always talk about when there's a slow August, the media needs something to go ahead and inflame. Well, 2010 was a midterm election year, and it was the first midterm elections after the election of Obama. So we find then that a lot of that racism, a lot of that bigotry that was now seething among so many people was unleashed in the 2010 election. And Muslims, because they have, relatively speaking, a lower amount of social and political capital in America, they then became the convenient scapegoats for this. So some of you probably remember in that August of 2010, Time magazine had a cover story that asked the question, is America Islamophobic? And that was authored by Bobby Ghosh, who was at that time an editor at Time magazine. Now he's moved on from there. But a little bit of background about that cover story. It started off as a dinner conversation between Bobby and me when he had come to Detroit on an unrelated matter. And he had said, can you explain what's going on with this seemingly non-issue about a building in downtown Manhattan and about this lunatic preacher who wants to come and burn Qurans? I said, listen, this is going to be bad for a while. This really has less to do with Muslims than it has to do with the fact that the majority of the country right now is feeling as though they are going to lose that minority. Now, mind you, this was 2 years before Rush Limbaugh and Bill O'Reilly were saying this. And he says, well, how certain are you? I said, well, of course, like any good researcher, I need to then go ahead and prove it. He said, please prove this for me. So I started to then dig deeper and look at what were the trends that were happening. And demographers said that by the year 2050, America will become a majority minority country. So it'll become a majority non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. And this was back around 2010, 2011. That number has actually accelerated. Now most people place that at the year 2043. So 27 years from now. And I'm sure that within the next decade, that number will expedite even faster. Most people will place this somewhere around 2035. So basically that means that if you have children this year, that by the time they graduate to high school and become eligible to vote, they are going to be part of the new majority. Is that? Oh, okay. But again, we need evidence to go ahead and show these things instead of basically doing what the media does and oftentimes makes things up or say things on the fly. The last time the census was taken in the United States was in the year 2010. They always do it in a year that ends in the number 0. And in that census, it showed that for the first time in American history, the number of non-white births eclipsed that of the white birth rate. 3 years later, the Pew Center for the Study of Religious Life came out with their report on religion in America and said that for the first time in American history, the country was no longer a majority Protestant country. The two largest religious groups at 30% each were the Catholics and the nuns, not Catholic nuns, but N-O-N-E-S, meaning no affiliation. So that means that the country was now becoming, and it was proven by the statistics, less white and more brown, less Anglo-Saxon and more Latin American, less Protestant and more Catholic. So we see then that the countdown has begun, and by 2012 you find that some of the leading opinion makers in the media were starting to become more explicit about that. If you want to understand the Trump supporters of today, if you want to understand the rhetoric, if you want to understand how he's appealing to them and how they are reacting to that, you have to understand these dates as to what's happening to the country. Now, of course, how do Muslims fit into that? We are not part of the demographic explosion. Our birth rates aren't much different than other communities. Our level of economic success is not much different from other communities. We are fairly American community, if you will. But you also find an anxiety that those people who feel as though they're losing power are losing power and it is at their expense, meaning that it is at someone else's gain. But it is not just at the gain of Muslims that they perceive. I mean, after all, they talk about how Muslims seem to be getting all of the accommodations of religion, but Christians are not. Somehow or the other, when Muslims complain, they get halal food, and whereas Christians are not allowed to say Merry Christmas anymore, they're allowed to say only Happy Holidays. So you see that these are the ways that the culture wars are being framed in the country, and of course they have no real basis to it. But at the same time, I wanted to explore how this is affecting Muslims in particular. Is Islamophobia a disease unto itself, or is it a symptom of this broader, what they call moral panic and anxiety that people are having? Now, if you look at Washington, not too many politicians there make a big deal about trying to restrict Muslims by passing anti-Sharia laws, anti-Masjid laws. Part of it is because Washington is in a state of paralysis and gridlock between the two parties in Congress. But something is happening in the country, and it was happening in plain sight. It's just that people weren't looking at it. Remember, we talked about how when most people think of the elections, they think of the presidential elections. Fewer people vote in the midterms, even fewer vote in the primaries or in off-year elections. But we find that it is those less attractive areas on the ballot that is having the biggest impact. It's happening at the state legislature. So it's happening in Austin, and it's happening in Tallahassee, and it's happening in Phoenix, and it's happening in Sacramento, and it's happening in Oklahoma City and across the country. So what I then embarked upon doing was to take a look at where does Islamophobia fit in at the state level, because nobody else was looking at it at that point. But it wouldn't really serve our purpose to only look at anti-Sharia and anti-Masjid bills that were being sponsored or co-sponsored. I wanted to map this in a bigger way. So alhamdulillah, I had 6 research students who took it upon themselves to go back to the year 2012 and look at 3 years worth of laws that were sponsored or co-sponsored in every one of the 50 states. But not just looking at Sharia and anti-mosque legislation. I wanted to look at what were the other areas of controversy at that time. One of the big issues right now you hear is about access to the polling booths. So I wanted to take a look at voter ID laws that were being passed in order to restrict people's ability to vote. These laws are, historically speaking, almost invariably enacted to target people of color. So people based essentially on race and ethnicity. I wanted to look at some of the immigration laws that were being passed, like in Arizona, which are essentially just profiling laws. So those are ones that affect ethnicity. I wanted to take a look at laws that restrict a woman's access to reproductive health care. Texas had a very, very restrictive law that was then actually struck down by the... Are we up? Alhamdulillah, okay. At the U.S. Supreme Court, having certain laws. Oh, jazakallah khair. Okay. The presentation. I'm sorry. Oh no problem. I'll just. I'll leave actually the slides with the brothers, so anybody is welcome to them if you like. Right. Looking at laws that were defining marriage, which of course affects people based on sexual orientation. And mind you, of course, this was then decided by the U.S. Supreme Court last summer, 2015, in the Obergefell Hodges case. Also, because I'm from Michigan, one of the segments of the population that is targeted is labor unions, because they tend to vote in a block for one political party. So we find that places like Wisconsin and Michigan, the cradles of and the home of the birth of these unions were targeted. And then finally looking at anti-Sharia and anti-foreign law bills. And what we found was essentially something which we had always suspected, but alhamdulillah, now we had the data. We found that these restrictive legislations were overwhelmingly supported by one political party, the Republican Party. But we also found that it wasn't really an issue of Republican versus Democrat. These were conflicts that were internal to the Republican Party, what we call red versus red. Remember that in 2010, a lot of the Republicans that came into power around the country were what we call Tea Party Republicans, who were in fact much more militant and strident than even what we call traditional or establishment conservative Republicans. So there was the debate going between them. And we also find that across the entire country, 50 states, that this restrictive legislation was really being driven by less than 13% of Republican lawmakers and the state level. And we'll talk about why this number is important. Now, when we talk about red states, for the purposes of our report, we didn't focus on it being a red state by the number of people who vote for Republicans versus Democrats. We use the definition of red state to mean that the governor and the state legislature were both majority Republican. A blue state would be where the governor and the state legislature were both Democrats. Purple states would be governor of one party, legislature of the other. Now, we found that 12.6% of all Republican state legislators around the country were involved in sponsoring or co-sponsoring a law in one of those 6 categories that I mentioned. 630 state legislators, which is only 16.5%, sponsored or co-sponsored an anti-Sharia law. So if you're feeling optimistic tonight, you can say that, 16.5% or 12.6% of all Republican legislators, which essentially means what? 1 out of every 8. That's not too many. That's a very, very small number of one political party. So basically what you're looking at is that, let's say it's even 50-50 across the country. You're looking at half of 1/8, so 1/16 of all legislators are behind us. If you're feeling a little bit pessimistic tonight, then you're going to have to think, wow, it's such a small number, but they wield that much power. Okay? And of course, for those of you who realize when you're looking at the glass half full, half empty, it's just half. It's both. So keep that in mind when it comes to how the numbers are important. When it comes to anti-Sharia law, those legislators that passed or tried to sponsor or co-sponsor an anti-Sharia bill had at a rate of 80% likelihood that they were sponsoring or co-sponsoring a law that was restrictive in one of those other areas. And what we find is that those who were passing or co-sponsoring or sponsoring a law that was restrictive against Sharia or Masjid tended to also try to block people's right to the polls. They were also behind these very strict voter ID laws, as well as right to work. Now, interestingly, they weren't as inclined to also sponsor with the same level of frequency anti-immigration laws because, of course, as you see, they were trying to disenfranchise Muslims and others from even being able to participate politically in the country with their right to vote. If you go to ispu.org/visualization, we have an interactive legislative map. So you can go from the years 2012 to 2015. You can click on any state, or you can click on one of the issues and you can find all of the laws as they're playing out. It's a really cool, I mean, if I say so myself, we got a tech kid to go ahead and put all the data together. So you can either isolate an issue, isolate a state, and you can compare the voting trends when it comes to these. And we're hoping to actually increase this, inshallah. We're looking to add more segments. So one of the other areas we're going to look at is gun control. The other we're going to look at is which politicians have had attitudes when it comes to laws concerning domestic violence. So we're trying to, inshallah, grow that out as well. Now, as a researcher, you always, of course, look to find research that makes things a little bit easier. And one area that I didn't think or didn't expect it to happen was with the state of North Carolina. North Carolina became a kind of one-stop shopping area for me doing the research on this project, because it's essentially confirmed everything that I had theorized. In 2013, the state of North Carolina, for the first time since right after the American Civil War, since Reconstruction, became a fully red state, meaning that the governor, Pat McCrory, was a Republican, and the state legislature was also Republican. And they couldn't wait to get started on a very restrictive agenda, because after all, anything that the legislature would enact, the governor was just ready to go ahead and sign the bill into law. So in that summer, there was the rather pleasantly sounding Family, Faith, and Freedom Protection Act. Now, with a name like that, even we'd want to go ahead and support it. I mean, who wouldn't want to protect faith? Who wouldn't want to protect freedom? And who wouldn't want to protect family? But we would have been cutting our own throats with that, because essentially what it was an anti-Sharia bill. But it wasn't. It was more than that. Before it went for the floor vote, at the last minute, somebody tacked on a whole series of anti-abortion provisions. And they really aren't anti-abortion provisions per se. They were simply restricting women's ability to get reproductive rights, reproductive health care. So if it came down to a physician who might have needed to go ahead and perform an abortion to save the life of the mother, there were enough restrictive standards that were then imposed upon this process to essentially make it impossible for them to have happen. But what this really shows then is the piggyback effect. It showed that once and for all, Islamophobia was not alone. Those targeting Muslims were also interested in targeting other groups as well. In this case, of course, women. At the same time, it also showed what was the primary purpose of the bill to begin with. If this would have been marked as an anti-abortion bill, the National Organization of Women and any number of other groups would have swooped down on North Carolina, and there would have been protests, and there would have been public debate, and there would have been media coverage, and most likely there would have been a capitulation on this. But by leading with it being an anti-Sharia bill, they knew that nobody was going to pay attention, because this would make North Carolina one of 38 states which had these in the pipeline. So it shows the way that they were maneuvering, that to scare people with Sharia and then to slide in what was the intended purpose of this bill. You got to admit, I mean, it's sneaky. After all, this is the same state which just over this past spring passed what's called the Public Facilities Privacy and Security Act in order to restrict the ability for transgendered individuals from using the public restroom of their choice, a case which the Supreme Court yesterday said that they will hear the appeal sometime this year. It's important, though, to understand yet again what North Carolina was trying to do with this bill. And of course the question will be like, how does a bill that restricts transgender from their choice of bathrooms to use, how does this affect Muslims? Well, you have to read the fine print in the bill that became a law. What North Carolina state legislators were also trying to do was prevent local governments, meaning cities, from passing anti-discrimination ordinances of any kind. So for example, the city of Charlotte, the city of Raleigh, the city of Durham, which is the home to Duke University, the city of Chapel Hill, which is the home of the University of North Carolina. They were passing laws that said that no one can be discriminated on the basis of, and among those things was religion. So essentially what the North Carolina State House was saying is no city can pass a law that would allow people to then restrict discrimination against even people of religious background as well. So this shows again how deep the agenda is going to try to disempower and disenfranchise people and essentially make discrimination fully legal. What are some of the other implications? Well, what the report shows is that America is part of a changing globe, but that Muslims are also part of a changing America. When it comes to the trends of voting, when it comes to the issues that they prioritize, there really is very little difference between the Muslim American community and any other community that you want to see based on gender, based on ethnicity, based on race. And instead of going ahead and seeing them as some kind of foreign body, some kind of an invasive group whose views, whose priorities, whose concerns are completely different than those of other Americans, we find here that Muslims are almost invariably within the same direction on all of these things. For Muslims, the report, inshallah, can provide a greater sense of self-awareness and education, not only about where the community stands on a state or on a national level, but what are the issues facing these other groups, having a better education about things like voter ID laws and some of the ways that government works. You know, when I came to America from England in the mid-70s, there used to be, and for several years on Saturday morning, these little snippets, these cartoons called Schoolhouse Rock. And they would go ahead and educate you on numbers, on parts of speech, and also how a bill becomes a law. I still remember it because there was a song that used to go with it, and I'm sure that if you ask anybody who grew up at that time, they can probably still remember the song and even the voice in which it was sung. But civics is so very critical to understand. When we see the way that the government works, when we see the way that the politicians and the legislatures work in order to go ahead and not liberate people or to expand people's rights, but in many ways to go ahead and restrict them, that has to then be seen as both a major predicament, but at the same time a tremendous level of promise that it is not just Muslims who are being targeted, but that this is part of a highly sophisticated, integrated, and coordinated effort. When it comes to broader society, because after all, these reports are not just for Muslim consumption, it was a way for other communities to see that Muslims are in fact very much in the same vein as they are in this country, and that the issues and the challenges that they are facing as Muslims are ones that are being visited on them as well. There's a phrase that some of you are familiar with called canaries in a coal mine. Essentially what used to happen is when miners were going to go down the shaft to a coal mine several thousand feet below, they used to lower first a canary in a cage. And if the canary came back alive, then it was safe for the miners to go down the shaft. If he came back dead, it meant that the fumes and the air down there was too toxic for human beings to be there. Well, in many ways, what this research shows is that Muslims are the canaries in the coal mine in this country. That the politicians will go ahead and try and test the waters if they can go ahead and get away with passing restrictive legislation against Muslims. If they can, if the coast is clear, then they'll go ahead and try to marginalize other communities as well. That is just by itself an important lesson for other communities outside the Muslim population to understand. For them to see that in many ways what is happening to Muslim Americans is something that either will happen to them or is happening to them. And so with that, it not only creates the opportunity for Muslims to be part of this broader mosaic, but it allows for a different kind of engagement. Some of these groups that I have mentioned have lobbying groups, have organizations, have advocacy and activists with far larger budgets, far greater history, and far greater measures of success than the Muslim American community. If Muslims are being piggybacked onto other laws that are restrictive, well, so too then is the possibility for Muslims to be piggybacked with other communities to go ahead and fight for rights that protect them. Well, part of this then has to come down to voting. This whole campaign of Yalla vote, I think, is pretty funny, because here in Texas, you can all say y'all vote, right? How can American Muslims increase their voter turnout and become more civically engaged? Well, there's three real strategies that the report demonstrated. There's the short term, there's the long term, and then, of course, there's the immediate get out the vote, or Go TV, which is underway right now as there are only 10 days left. Preach and teach has been very, very effective. Some of you are probably aware that a few weeks ago was when the deadline or the cutoff date was to register to vote in most states. It was, I think, October 11th. And through the use of social media, there was a campaign that went through groups like Emerge and other Muslim American organizations, which then got many imams to sign on to this, so that on Jummah, they at least incorporated into their khutbahs something about both the importance to vote and, more importantly, the importance to register to vote. So we find that these techniques of preaching and teaching have yielded a tremendous level of impact. We find also through the data that there is a correlation between Muslim attendance or participation at the masjid level and greater civic engagement. Basically saying those Muslims who come to the masjid also then go out of the masjid and interact and engage in their communities. I'm not sure if it can be possibly overemphasized about how much it's important to teach civics. We find that particularly in Michigan and the Metro Detroit area, the efforts that are being made to compensate for either what the older generation doesn't know or what the younger generation isn't being taught effectively is something that now Masajid are starting to do. Just as there are other programs when it comes to the curriculum on weekend schools or some of the other programming that Muslim youth groups are doing, we find it to be absolutely critical to go ahead and teach what is proper civics of the country, what issues fall under which jurisdiction. One of the most embarrassing and most unfortunate things that we find is when a politician comes to our masajid and people who have very good intentions ask the wrong questions. So oftentimes what happens is near election day, there'll be a bunch of local candidates who will come in, some on the local city council, some running for state representative, even the governor. And somebody will raise a hand and say, "What are you going to do about Palestine?" Person says, "Nothing, because I'm not working for the federal government. It's not part of my mandate." So that level of sophistication as to which box do these things fit in is very important. You wouldn't ask Obama for a zoning variance at the same time, but you would ask somebody on the zoning commission. So this kind of sophistication is very important. And alhamdulillah, you find groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations at the local level and at the national level are publishing guides, publishing how-tos to understand how these things are done at each level. And it also shows then how strategy needs to be employed because of how limited our resources are. Smart strategy when it comes to long-term planning, building from the grassroots up is so critical. I was looking on my Facebook feed today of how many Get Out the Vote campaigns are going on in my community in Detroit and Dearborn. And you find that the Muslim youth are essentially for the next 10 days, in whatever free time they have, going door to door, getting on phone banks, getting the information in whatever networks they are. Last night I was at Valley Ranch Islamic Center, and Sheikh Omar Suleiman was kind enough to Facebook Live the talk. And he said, we've got about 100 people in the audience here. We have 40,000 on Facebook Live. And he says, now don't get nervous. I said, yeah, I don't get nervous, alhamdulillah, but it blew my mind. I'm still fascinated by technology. And to sit here and think that somebody is just using an app like Facebook, and he, mashallah, Sheikh Omar has 40,000 followers. But to see that not only were they following it, but they were interacting because they were sending questions that we were then able to answer. And I got into contact with a couple of former students who were watching. They told me that my hair is grayer now. But there are so many ways that the information can get out. And perhaps what's more important than that is to provide a sense of hope and optimism that voting is not in vain. Because there are going to be people who are going to think that it's not going to count, it's not going to make a difference, or the candidates are particularly lousy. And actually, when I have discussions with people about this election campaign, I don't mention the H word and I don't mention the D word. I don't talk about who's going to be president, but I'm really interested with who's running for some of these down ballot issues. So we find then that some of these things that I was talking about when it comes to canvassing, when it comes to leveraging, can be long-term goals. I'll give you an example about how effective this is. In 2012, Obama won re-election. But the way that they won and how effectively they did it is they looked at every single precinct. Okay? They didn't even look at every district. They went down to the precinct level. And they took a look at how was the margin of victory in 2008. And in some of these precincts, the margin of victory, one way or the other, was 15 votes. Okay? And I think Michelle Obama mentioned this a few days ago at a rally. So what they did was this. They went door to door, and they said, let's see if we can convince some of these people to flip over. And sometimes, of course, that's not very successful at all. So they went through and they registered twice as many people as the margin for defeat. They simply went in there and said, let's get people to vote the other way. And they did this on a micro level. And this was one of the reasons why he already knew before the day began that they had the election. So that kind of micro detail when it comes to sophisticated strategy and being data-driven is very, very effective. There is now almost an inescapable amount of information regarding the top of the ticket. But when it comes to what are the views of some of the people running, particularly at state and local levels, that's really interesting and that's very important to go ahead and try to gain. But the other way that Muslims are becoming part of the process is attending party conventions. This year in Philadelphia at the Democratic National Convention, there were about 100 Muslims there as either delegates or speakers. That's a massive number and a massive increase from 4 years ago. Working the polls, and particularly as we find in Michigan, more people running for office. We were very fortunate that we had Rashida Tlaib, who served 2 terms in the Michigan House of Representatives. She got term limited out because of the Michigan Constitution. But inshallah, she's somebody who we're looking at maybe running for Congress within 10 years. But in order to replace her, we have an individual like Ahmed Hamoud, and of course you know about the sister in Minneapolis, the Somali sister, I think Ilhan Omar, who's also running. So there is now a light or a spark that has started, particularly among the millennials, to go ahead and vote. If you're interested, if you go to ISPU's website, you can see what we call the Inshallah Voter video. The Inshallah Voter, of course, like in many other ways, you say, hey, are you going to do something? And the person says, Inshallah. Which means you basically have to grab them by the shoulders and say, can you flip that to being like a yes? Because inshallah, unfortunately, to too many people is a no or a maybe not. maybe switching it from an inshallah to subhanallah. We like to think that it's important of having an optimistic conclusion here, and we find that when it comes to the recommendations that we give, it's not, again, about how to vote for a particular political party or for an individual. We don't want to jeopardize our tax-exempt status. But we do talk about the importance of education. We talk about the importance of amplifying the information to get it out to as many people as possible. And we talk about the essential value of coalition building. We find that particularly this year, some of the groups from around the country have come up and defended and protected Muslims, and particularly the Muslim civic and political right to be involved, which is critical. And of course, last but not least, voting is critical. So with that, Jazakallah khair for your precious time. Inshallah, I'll take any questions that you have in the remaining 10 minutes before the Qiyam. Yes, brother.
You mentioned the 16.5 voting the entire Sharia. So is 83.5 against the entire Sharia now?
That's a good question. That's a good question. The question is about the 16.5% of Republican state legislators which sponsored or co-sponsored an anti-Sharia bill. They were just the ones who sponsored or co-sponsored it. But the overwhelming majority of Republicans voted for them. Yeah, they were not ones who were against the bill. They just simply didn't sponsor or co-sponsor. See, what happens is when a bill is going through, a lawmaker or a legislator will go ahead and draft the bill, or one of his aides will. And then in order for it to be considered in either committee or coming up to the floor vote, it has to get the attention of whoever is the House Majority Leader or the Senate Majority Leader, depending on which chamber it's in. Generally speaking, if it's a single person-sponsored bill, the likelihood of that getting a full floor vote is very low, because the majority leader will say, if you're the only person who seems interested in this, why should I go ahead and waste the time of the full legislature? Because remember, every bill has to then be debated. There's a debate time. So the more people that sponsor and co-sponsor a piece of legislation, that then gives it more of an oomph and the ability to be on the radar of the House Majority Leader. So these are people who either sponsored or are tacked on. Now, the other reason why people will go ahead and sign on and sponsor or co-sponsor a bill is when they're running for re-election, they can say, we were, because they were saying it with pride, we stood up to radical Islamic terrorism because we went ahead and we sponsored, or this candidate sponsored an anti-Sharia bill. So that's the way that the game is played. Yes, brother. Right. Okay, so the question is, what are the most effective ways to be engaged civically? If you have the time, or if you can make the time to be involved in, even, as you said, going to a PTA meeting, going to the school board meetings, it is so critical to hear what people are saying and what people are deciding. Now, your average school board meeting, they have like a regular calendar. You can go to the school district and you can see when they meet. It's usually at the minimum of one evening a month or so. Many of these are city council meetings that occur. The attendance from the public may be 5-10 people, and only diehards or people who have a particular issue. But when it comes to an issue of controversy, it is standing room only. I'll give you an example. In Sterling Heights, Michigan, a group of Syrian Muslims wanted to build a new center. The Iraqi Christian community came out in somewhere between 500 and 600 people to this city council meeting, and they were able to effectively block it. the Masjid couldn't have been, or the Islamic Center was not given authorization. They made excuses of saying, well, this is going to add to traffic patterns and all of this stuff. But the true reason was there's a lot of tension between Iraqi Christians and the Muslim community. I mean, they basically hate Muslims because of the situation in Iraq. They wield an awful lot of influence because they're small business owners, so their tax base essentially funds the mayor and the city council. So it was no surprise that that happened. Many Muslims said, well, we should have gone ahead and been at the meeting as well, but we didn't know it was there. These are matters of public record. The other thing that I've found is not only attending civic and political meetings like that and being involved in boards if they can volunteer or be part of groups like PTAs and all, is I'm a board member of the Michigan Coalition on Human Rights. And so one of the things that we get is not only requests, but we in fact proactively try to find issues. So one of the big issues that we were involved with, and that alhamdulillah Muslims were really at the forefront, was Flint, Michigan, with the water. Raising awareness of that, going ahead and doing something about it. I mean, people found out that Muslims were the only consistent distributors of water. Some people were coming in as volunteers on the weekends, but Muslims were actually, they had organized and set something up for every single day. Doctors volunteered their time, and they set up an actual dermatology clinic at one of the distribution centers, because what was happening with the lead in the water is people were coming with lesions, they were coming with keloids, which were disfiguring. As an unintended consequence of this. So we had people on the ground doing that. We were able to raise the visibility of these issues, and we were also able to coordinate with other groups, because after all, it wasn't just Muslims coming in to do these things. One of the big challenges that always exists is how do you maintain those relationships after a crisis? And one of the things that we have tried to mobilize as effectively as possible is to say that every person who came and volunteered, what group are you from, what other groups are you involved in, let's over social media or other ways stay coordinated. And so we find then that there is life after that project. So.
Quick question.
Yes.
This apparent disagreement between what they call establishment Republicans and does it offer any hope towards reform within the Republican Party?
Oh, wow. Okay, so the question is about the, I guess we can call it the civil war between or among Republicans. I think at this stage, irrespective of what happens a week from Tuesday, there's going to have to be some soul searching within the Republican Party. There was the promise of that happening in 2012. And in fact, if you remember that the postmortem of the 2012 election was that a lot of the main Republican brass, they got together and said, we have to have more outreach. We have to go ahead and get to these other communities. Because remember, in 2043 or whatever the date is going to be, the country is going to become majority-minority. But those minorities are going to be mixed. And so essentially all the Republicans would have to do, or the conservatives, is to break the unity or the solidarity of all of the minority coalition and just pull one of them over to their side, and they will then have the majority again. So these are some of the strategies that are being thought of right now. But what we've found in this last year is that the Republicans have done such a spectacular job of alienating everybody that it's leaving a very, very bitter taste in the mouth of many, many groups. So you may find, and they love to wheel these people out, what's his name? Sajid Javid, the bald Muslim who was at the Republican National Committee. Or they might find somebody from the LGBTQ community who says, well, I'm voting for Trump, or women for Trump and all this. But these people are outliers. There is no credible critical mass of the Latino community, the LGBTQ community, the Muslim community, the African American community, and several other communities that feel as though there's any level of inclusiveness within the Republican Party. Now, there are some who believe that, and there are some people who will go ahead and even try to appeal to matters of either social conservatism or matters of fiscal conservatism. But right now, the dominant voice in the Republican Party is not that particular segment of it. So, yes. Right. That's a great question. So how do you keep in contact with candidates who then become elected officials? Well, first of all, there's two things. One, I actually am not that fond of politicians in general. My level of engagement doesn't really involve politicians. But when I do engage with politicians, I don't really care for the photo op. In fact, I always tell my students in college when they say, Professor Khan, you meet with so-and-so and you meet with so-and-so, isn't that cool? I mean, you get to meet with, I met with Biden and people. I said, I'm not thrilled. I mean, it just sort of happens. And I always tell them, I said, if any of you are interested in doing this, I said, don't focus on the person. Focus on the person standing next to them with a clipboard. I said, you focus on the assistant and develop a relationship with that person. Because you're going to get 5 seconds with that individual, you're going to get one selfie, and that person's going to forget you. They won't even remember how much is on your check that you gave them as a donation. That other person is with them 24/7. You talk to that person and you talk in their ear, that makes all the difference. The second thing is that every politician comes home. I'm not sure how much they work in Washington or Austin, but on the weekends, they definitely come back to their districts. They hold town hall meetings, get in their face, get in their grill, and go ahead and interact with them there. Invite them here. Invite them to centers, invite them to homes. They actually, they like doing that kind of stuff because it's free publicity for them as well. And I think one of the things that is very critical to remember now is that, alhamdulillah, Muslims have turned the corner. No one is turning down Muslim donations. That was something that they were doing as recently as 4 years ago, and certainly 8 years ago. There is no more this idea that no one wants to be photographed with a Muslim. So we should go ahead and leverage those things very effectively. The other thing is, I always find it important to go ahead and not just be the Muslims walking into a meeting with a politician. Go as a coalition. Go with representatives of other communities, whether it's faith communities or other advocacy groups. Because it'll do two things. There's strength in numbers, and they see that Muslims are integrated with these other groups instead of just being outliers. That usually works very, very well. Yeah. Okay. All right. Jazakallah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair, Professor Said. Our only regret is that we couldn't have a bigger audience, alhamdulillah. If anybody wants a copy of the presentation, please email me at junaid.deen, my first name, my last name, at EPICMASJID.org. So inshallah you can get that from me, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh. We can, inshallah, we'll start the qiyam in 5 minutes, inshallah.